All right. So today is July the
8th.
July the 8th,
Yeah,
2018. I'm Matthew Monk for the National Woven Coverlet Project for the National Museum of American History. If you could please state your name for the camera.
Is Cassie Dickson.
And where were you born, Cassie?
I was born in Louisville, Mississippi. My family's from Mississippi.
And where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Brandon, Mississippi. That's very close to Jackson.
Okay. And where have you lived throughout your life?
I've lived, my husband and I were kind of interested in a lot of rivers, rafting, kayaking, paddling, and I lived in North Georgia for about 3 years, and I moved to North Carolina, and I've lived here for about 30.
And what jobs or careers have you had throughout your life?
I've been a teacher and a physical education teacher, and I've, for the last 20 years I worked for Western Carolina University as a college and career guidance counselor, and I retired in 2016.
And what do you do for a living now?
I'm a teacher. I teach my crafts, and I teach at schools like Penland and Aramont and John C. Campbell. I just recently taught in Massachusetts at a snow farm, and I present at museums.
All right. So now we're going to break right into coverlets.
Okay. All right.
So how did you first get started weaving, and then what led that into coverlet weaving?
My first experience with, I never really thought I'd be a weaver. I started spinning first because my grandmother had taught me all the old crafts of knitting, crocheting, to sew my own clothes and do embroidery work and crewel work, and I really just enjoyed spinning wool. And then I got interested in dyeing, natural dyeing using plants, and I was on the Natchez Trace at a little fair one year, and I saw a lady that was weaving some natural dyed shawls, which were very popular in the 1970s, and I went up to her and I said, I want to be a weaver and I need to know what kind of loom to buy. And she said, you need to come over to my house, and I did. And so I bought not a little loom, a big loom, and that one right there, my big Maycomber.
So what got you interested in coverlet weaving specifically?
I was living in Vicksburg, and I was kind of experimenting with, I was doing blankets, natural dyed, using wool, and so a friend of mine told me about this elderly lady that lived in Vicksburg, and she said she really doesn't get out much. She was in probably her late 70s when I met her, and when I went over, I called her, and she said, absolutely, come over and see me. And she was incredible. I mean, she was a master weaver of coverlets and traditional linens. And right then, the first time she opened up a bedspread, I said, Nona, this is what I want. I've got to learn how to do this. Her name was Nona Ledbetter.
So that sort of segues us into the next question of how did you learn to weave?
I took a formal, I guess my first weaving I did on a cardboard loom with hand spun wool, and I made pillows. And then when I got into weaving, I took a formal class, a 2-week class at Aramont School of Arts and Crafts, and learned the basics of just threading the loom and everything. And I came home to find my new loom waiting for me that I'd ordered, and I started weaving, started learning.
Describe your own research and scholarship into coverlet weaving. What sorts of things have you used to sort of learn how to weave the coverlets that you weave?
Well, Nona taught me probably everything about coverlet weaving. We would stay up at night and sit at the table and just do math. We would do hours and hours of coverlet planning and math and where we were going to put our seams, and and the shrinking of the threads when it was washed, and how I was going to square up my patterns. So I would say a lot of time went into just planning the coverlet before I started weaving, and I'm always ambitious. And my first coverlet I hand spun and natural dyed the wool and wove it, and my seams, the leaves all match, but I probably could have done a little bit better job now seaming or planning just where I was going to put my seam, you know, but it's something I'm proud of.
What's the most challenging or difficult aspect of coverlet weaving?
I think probably the most challenging, well, if you look at this big leaf right here, you can only see this much of that leaf when you're weaving and the pattern. And you've got to, like I said, you know, you've got to make sure your seams are it's gonna be the right size you want. And but I think just getting it to when you wash it, that it's going to square up and make a nice square. So you've got to weave it a little elongated. You have to have the right threads. You've got to have figured everything right, and you've got to weave with a very consistent beat. And you cannot weave angry, you cannot weave upset. If your mind is not really focused on your weaving, you need to just take a break and go do something else.
What are the key characteristics of the coverlet weaving tradition? What identifies coverlets specifically?
Well, I think there were the overshot coverlets, the summer and winter patterns, and I don't know a lot about the jacquard, but I mean, I've read about them, and I've never seen. I have a friend that does do draw loom weaving, and I've seen the process and I understand it, but you know, I look at them and they're just like a professional weaver coming in and doing those. I'm really drawn to the overshot coverlets that the mountain women wove. It's probably my favorites.
So how long does it take you to weave a coverlet, one of those overshots?
I have about 80 hours to 100 hours in a coverlet, and that's if I don't spin the thread or natural dye it. And if I natural dye it, it would take me another at least week, and if I hand spun it and natural dyed and wove it, it would take me a month of working 8-hour days.
So what's the significance of the overshot coverlet to Appalachian history and to Southern women's history?
Well, some of my favorite, this lady right here, I always put these ladies out. This lady was, I think Doris Ullman took this photo, and it's in Alan Eaton's book. She was characterized as an old-time weaver in Shooting Creek, which is right over the mountain between Franklin and Hayesville. My son was actually born in that valley, and there's could be more than one Shooting Creek, but that's the one I think of. And I love this. She's got the pine cone bloom coverlet, which I've woven probably 10 or 12 of those coverlets and sold them over the years. And but it's in the background. The seams don't match, but it does not offend me. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture.
And who's the photograph of?
It just says an old-time weaver. She wasn't identified that I know of. I would love to see if I could find out who she was.
What can you tell me about the origins of coverlet weaving? Where does the overshot tradition come from? Do you know?
I know that they were woven in the 1700s, and I guess the heyday was 1810 to 1850-ish. I think people brought the traditions with them from their countries of origin, not necessarily the overshot, but some of the patterns that kind of morphed into these patterns. Other than that, I'm not really sure.
And what are the different, what you mentioned it a little bit, what are the different variations and styles and structures of woven coverlets?
Well, the overshot, summer and winter, the twills, and multi-harness coverlets, the jacquard. Yeah.
So what is overshot structure? If you were to explain what overshot is to a layperson who's never laid hands on a loom.
Well, when I think of overshot, I think that to describe it, it has a background fabric that is a tabby or a over and under base fabric. and the colored threads, the wool or whatever you're using to make the patterns the pattern overshoots a group of threads to create a pattern. And so if you think about it, if that is treadled 10 times, it would come out if you came back the other way. So it's a 2 shuttles. You throw one shot of a colored thread and then another shot of your base fabric, your tabby thread, to lock it in.
So in what ways did early coverlet weavers record their patterns? So if I were weaving, for instance, a double bow knot, how would I know how to replicate that pattern?
Well, they used a lot of these patterns were on strips of paper, and they would roll those strips of paper and clip them, and then save them like as a protection, a way to protect them. And they had all different types of ways that they read their drafts, notations that they would do. So fortunately, a lot of people that have written books and figured out their drafts have documented different weaving, how to read their drafts on those papers.
So what were some of the design sources that coverlet weavers were using as inspiration?
I think that it's just amazing, but if I had a pattern that I created or came up with, I would tell my friend who would go maybe on a trip down the road to Raleigh and meet somebody and say, oh, I know this lady, she's making this coverlet pattern. And these patterns they went everywhere, and from up north, Canada, all the way to the deep south. That people were, and they would come up with different patterns just by combining different motifs, or
So what's the design inspiration for your coverlets? What sources and resources do you use to? I
probably own every coverlet book that has ever come out, and now we have all these resources online that I never had the first 20 years that I was weaving bedspreads. I never had internet, so it's like a new world for me, as I can go online and find old drafts and coverlet pictures and things that have been locked away in museums, in drawers, in basements, that I will never be able to see, but now I can.
So with that said, how do you develop and design your patterns?
Well, I am going to be probably coming up with some new patterns that over the years, I would weave for people. So they would look through my books, they would see a pattern that they liked, and then I would weave that pattern for them. So mostly I've done just reproduction. Sometimes I do different natural dyes, madder, and I do an indigo and do different dyes, but and make them a little bit special. But most of them are just out of books that I've done.
And so, what fibers did coverlet weavers traditionally use, and did that change over time?
They used linen, cotton, and wool. I think some of the ones even in the 1700s were hand-spun linen and cotton, hand-spun cotton combinations. I think the National Museum of the American Coverlet has one that's 1775, I think, that is a linen, cotton, and wool coverlet. So they did learn different ways. I will say this: when you could readily assess cotton yarns by maybe 1810, life got easier for the weavers. They could then spend more time spinning their wool and natural dyeing, and that's why there were so many coverlets made between 1810 and 1850, because they didn't have to go through the long process of flax to linen.
So where do you get your yarns and why?
I order from Henry's Attic. They have the linens that I need, and I can buy them wholesale, which really is cost effective if you're using a lot of linen. And I get my wools from Jagger Spun. Now, 40, 30 years ago, there was a company in Oregon that had beautiful colors, old-timey colors, and the wool was kind of a rougher texture like a coverlet wool, and I ordered from them all the time. Then we saw the industry change. The sweaters started coming in, yarns started getting softer, commercial colors, more bright, vibrant colors, and the coverlet yarns that I use are a certain fineness because I really like to weave a 40 to the inch like the old timers did, at least 40 to the inch, and I need a really fine wool, so I order my wool from Jagger Spun, and I only use their black, their brown, and their red, and if I need another color, I natural dye it.
Tell me a little bit about mercerized versus unmercerized cotton and warp yarns and why that matters.
Well, I really like the look of old coverlets, and for years for 20 years I could buy from the Mannings. I bought most of my warp yarn from the Mannings. I could get a 24/3 or 20/2, 20/3 unmercerized cotton. Then the industry again started changing, and unmercerized was getting harder to find, and you could only buy mercerized. I found a lady that I bought her out actually of all the pounds and pounds of a yarn unmercerized similar to a 20/2, and when it runs out I will only use linen because I really don't like the shininess of a mercerized cotton.
So what tools are involved in coverlet weaving? What does a person who aspires to weave a coverlet need in order to do that?
Well, I would say for 20 years I did chain warps. I had a warping board that was handmade, and I did long warps that were chain, and it took a lot of time. And I'm very slow to progress. And when I bought my loom, it was a Maycomber add a harness, and I could weave up to 10 harnesses, and I could also get a sectional beam. And so 20 years after weaving coverlets, I bought a sectional beam, and life got really easier. I still do chain warps, but if I'm putting on a 30-yard warp, it sure is a lot easier doing a sectional beam. And other than that, I've never used a spreader. What do you call it? A tensioner? A temple. I have never used that. I was just asked that recently, and they said, you don't use a temple for your seams? And I said, no, I've never used one in my life, and I don't even know how to use one.
So describe the steps of coverlet weaving from start to finish in a nutshell for me.
Okay, I find a pattern that I like, I look at the draft, and I sit down and I figure out how big, I'll just take this one for instance. So my double bow knot, I'll measure and see how big that is, and then how big my tables are. So the length of number of threads from here to here, I'm going to figure out that, and then I'm going to calculate how wide I want the coverlet to be. If it's going to be for a double bed, a king size bed, I'm going to figure out where I'm going to divide this. I usually divide my coverlets in a table, and so I'll figure out, I usually do 3 panels because the center seam, your eyes are drawn to a center seam. So I really like a 3-panel coverlet because you never see the seam on the bedspread. And then it's just a lot of math and figuring to see how that pattern, you're going to make that. I know what threads I use because I use them all the time, and I just got to see if I'm going to add a border section to it to make it like to have a panel on it, or if or if a border is not needed on that. But I've got to calculate every single thing, from how much is it going to shrink, how much, when I sew those panels together, where am I going to seam it? And the math takes hours to do. And then once I do that, I usually put it on and I start weaving a section, and then I'll wash it, and I'll see how much it's going to shrink up, and if I like everything looks good, I start weaving.
All right, so you mentioned table a little bit. So do you mind to hold that coverlet up and kind of give a kind of anatomy of the
this
coverlet?
one?
Yeah, to kind of explain to people who have probably never seen a coverlet before, sort of what the anatomy of a coverlet, of an overshot coverlet, is in terms of how the patterns are created with tables and blocks.
Well, this pattern is in Eliza Calvert Hall's book. She calls this pattern Lady's Delight, and I'm sure it was called other things. It's also called a double bow knot with a window sash table, and I've divided 3 panels into my seams are in one of these panels. So most of coverlets have what's called a motif, and then a table are these filled in places. That's what I call a table, and this is called what the motif is. And this particular coverlet is a double bow knot, and this is when you see a grouping of like 4 tables like this and a little grouping that comes in, it's like they called window sash. And and like I said, in Eliza Calvert Hall's book, this was also called Lady's Delight, and coverlets had many names depending on what area of the country you lived in. It could have been called something else.
So what kinds of, we've talked about this a little bit, but what kinds of special skills and knowledge and ability are required to weave a coverlet?
A lot of patience and a consistent beat. You really do have to walk away. If you don't have a mindset and a focus of where you can clear your mind, your seams will just never match if you're not in that frame of mind. You get into a rhythm, a very rhythm movement, and you just have to be patient because you're weaving. There was an old-time weaver that said in one of the books that were interviewed, she goes, "I just love watching the flowers grow." And I always think about that as you're watching the pattern grow. It's the same, the stars or the flowers or whatever you're weaving, you're watching them grow. You may be weaving yards and yards of it, but that's what you just sit there and you're just watching it grow. You know, people say, "How can," my sister does that. She'll say, "How can you just sit and weave the same thing constantly throw the shuttle for hours?" And I go, "I don't even think about it."
So do you have a favorite coverlet weaver, and if so, why?
Oh, I would have to say these, I'm very passionate about the old-time weavers. And before I weave a coverlet, I always kind of talk to them. I just always say, "All those coverlet weavers before me, please guide my hands." And that's real special, the old-time weavers. We're kindred spirits.
What's your favorite type of coverlet, structurally and visually, and why?
I am drawn to overshot and to summer and winter are my 2 favorite weave structures to weave.
Why?
I just love the geometric and of them and the patterns that just come. I love them. I don't know, I'm just drawn to them. First time I ever saw a coverlet, I knew I had to weave them.
So what do you think the importance of the woven coverlet is to American history and to craft history?
Oh, I think the weaving enthusiasts of the early 1900s that recorded these drafts, that went and interviewed Weaver Rose and some of these old-time weavers that were weaving these bedspreads and wrote down the names of, I mean, even if they changed, they're beautiful. And the patterns they did, whether the seams matched or not, they served a function. They were for warmth, and they were for beauty. And it enriched their lives. They were proud of them. They hung them behind for family portraits. And I'm just so grateful that we have the Appalachian Mountain Coverlets and that we have photos of them and we have them in museums today.
So for whom do you weave coverlets, and how often do you weave coverlets for people?
I probably have woven maybe 40 coverlets over the years, and word of mouth. I weave them for friends, for family. I've got 3 orders right now I've got to get done, and somebody always cross my path that want some of my weaving. So.
And what do you value most about what you do, and why?
I think I'm just keeping tradition going, and it's something I am passionate about, I love, and hopefully somebody will want to learn it before I'm gone.
So that brings us into the next question. What do you think the future of coverlet weaving is?
I think there will always be somebody that wants to learn the tradition. I really do believe that. You know, they probably were saying that when I came along, and you know, my teacher, who was almost 80, in her 80s, I had her for 5 years. Nona lived about 5 years, and was taught me everything that she knew. And she probably at the time thought, well, you know, she probably won't. She'll weave one, and but I have kept that tradition going, and I will till I die.
And so if somebody was interested in learning to weave coverlets, what are some of the different ways they could go about doing that?
Well, there are some books on it, and also I think maybe contacting somebody like me or taking a class, a traditional weaving class, and then just doing research. There's so much, you know, practicing and doing the patterns and learning their own system of sewing their seams together. You know, you can do all types of seams on your coverlet. So, and people are particular about different seam structures. So it's really doing it.
So what awards and accolades have you received for your weaving and your craft work?
I don't enter contests. The only thing I did recently was the Fold Unfold presentation that was put on a grant written by at the Savannah School of Arts in Savannah, Georgia. And they asked for coverlet weavers all over, from Canada to all over America, to weave a coverlet. And these were first-time weavers, some of them, of coverlet weaving. And they did what was called Fold Unfold, and I had 3 coverlets in that event.
And what current projects are you working on in regards to coverlets and linen, your work with linen production?
I have 3 coverlets that I've got to probably weave before Christmas, and then I'm constantly spinning flax to linen and doing linen textiles.